a lot of those hunters don't know of these scrapes on the fringes of these bedding areas that bucks are hitting almost every day during daytime hours. They're harder to find, but if you can find the right scrape, and if you can start to discern, is that a scrape that has potential, or is that the type that I shouldn't be hunting? Like, if you can start to get a feel for determining, making that decision, I think you're going to find that scrapes are, once again, an ultimate key or tool for hunters to be using.
And one of the things I was most excited about talking to you about is scrapes. I love scrapes. I love hunting scrapes. I love putting cameras on scrapes. I like finding scrapes. They're just one of my favorite things ever in the deer woods. So, and I know that you're big into them as well. So just give me a quick rundown on your philosophy around scrapes and hunting around scrapes.
Yeah, I mean, scrapes are a huge tool for me. I know we talked a lot even about them for scouting, preseason inventory, all that. For me, a scrape, it's like the ultimate factor and way to get as much intel in a certain area than anything else. Like, you can be on trails, you can even set cameras up on food sources and, get an idea how many deer in that area. But it seems like there's certain scrapes that I honestly feel that any buck within a few miles will eventually come to that scrape, especially if they've had some history and they know of that specific scrape. It's just amazing the amount of different bucks you can get on scrapes. And it's always something that I feel, I said it in the last podcast too, I don't think there's ever a day that a buck isn't interested in a scrape. Maybe he doesn't work it physically, but he at least will check it out as he goes by. So it's really the ultimate tool or location for hunters to take advantage of, whether you're using trail cameras or even hunting. Like, I don't know if there's a better way or if there's anything better out there to take advantage of.
Yeah. I did this on the last one. I'm going to keep doing it on this one, but tying it back to our experiences in Alabama, years ago, me and a buddy of mine put some cameras out on a piece of public land in South Alabama, and we found a couple big scrapes, and we left cameras on them from probably late October. Our bow season opens October 15th. The rut in this area is mid-January. We left them out there until turkey season, and then we went and picked them up. And we went through and we looked at every single buck that came by those cameras. And there was one scrape in particular where, not talking spikes or anything, but racked bucks. There was 27 different racked bucks that came by this scrape during the season. And it just blew our minds because we're like, I don't even know there's that many rack bucks running around out there, in that one general area. And I still can't kill any of them, but that's beside the point. A lot of people will look at scrapes as a way to maybe buck inventory, like what I'm talking about, but you like actually hunting around the scrapes, and you'll hear people be like, oh, it's only nighttime activity.
Yep.
Just again, right here off the top, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say there's a good percentage of scrapes that you're going to see that mainly get nighttime activity, but it's all about the location of the scrape. I mean, there are scrapes that I know of, many that I get 90% daytime pictures versus nighttime pictures. And I think when a lot of people think of a scrape, they think of that scrape along a field edge or the edge of a food plot or a cornfield or in some high traffic feeding area where that's just simply where deer are spending most of the nighttime hours. And you're going to find way more scrapes in those areas, and you're going to start to think that, like, well, that just must be where scrapes are generally located, around feeding areas or these highly concentrated areas. But like, a lot of those hunters don't know of these scrapes on the fringes of these bedding areas that bucks are hitting almost every day during daytime hours. They're harder to find, but if you can find the right scrape, and if you can start to discern, is that a scrape that has potential, or is that the type that I shouldn't be hunting? Like, if you can start to get a feel for determining, making that decision, I think you're going to find that scrapes are, once again, an ultimate key or tool for hunters to be using.
Mm-hmm. And the thing about scrapes, especially for guys like us three that hunt public land, is we don't have access. You can't bait, especially all the places that we hunt. Some states allow minerals and stuff like that, but you can't bait, which for a lot of people on private land, that's if they can bait, is a prime spot. They can put a camera. They can get inventory of all kinds of stuff at different times of day and night. For guys on public land, it is the one thing you can put a camera on that you can get deer coming from all different directions, all different areas, if it's in the right location, and get tons of inventory in season, before season, and so on, in a spot where you can kind of really figure out what's in the area and how they're using it. And you're saying that there's some scrapes that lend themselves better for daylight activity. I think that's the one thing everybody's trying to find. Yeah. What is the scrape I can put a camera on that has daylight activity? You mentioned they're around bedding areas specifically. Yeah. One thing that we haven't mentioned quite yet in this episode, you're hunting big woods, big expanses of timber up here in Pennsylvania, no ag, not really any open ground outside of like clear cutting activity, which is very similar to a lot of stuff we hunt back south. So there's a lot of similarities there. Can you talk about what do some of these bedding areas look like kind of later in the season, especially when you're talking October, November? What do they look like around here? Where do you kind of typically find them? And then we'll go into positioning of where you may find scrapes, because probably not every bedding area is going to have a scrape next to it.
Oh, yeah. And as far as locating bedding areas, I especially find most bedding areas just in thicker pockets of cover. And we talked a little bit about clear cuts before. Obviously, clear cuts are great for bedding areas, but I go even beyond that. Like sometimes it's just like, I don't know if you guys have it down south, but we have a lot of what they call beach brush. It's this just thick, nasty understory type stuff, and it holds leaves. It will hold its leaves sometimes well into the winter, and like that makes for like some of the best bedding habitat. And I usually just start with finding thicker cover and higher elevations, because most of our bedding is up high. And then when I do find beds within the cover or signs of bedding activity, to find the scrapes, I usually just start walking the perimeters, the transition of the cover between the open woods. And like I've said, maybe when we just had regular conversations, I sometimes will walk the entire perimeter of a thicket and maybe I find one scrape. But to me, that one scrape is probably going to be better than any scrape I find within any feeding activity or feeding areas within that general area. Like, for instance, when you have scrapes around bedding versus feeding, it literally boils down to, when we're talking mature deer especially, where are mature deer generally more throughout daytime hours? Around bedding area. So that's where you need to be. A lot of their feeding is at night. A lot of the sign they throw down is at night. So I always tell myself this too. Generally, a lot of times when you're finding boatloads of buck sign, there's a good chance there's quite a bit of night activity there. You might be a mile off from where that deer spends his daytime hours. So those scrapes, once again, the good ones are usually harder to find. But when you start to be able to locate bedding areas and you start to get a feel for where they set up these scrapes, those, I'm telling you, are going to be the scrapes you're going to get more daytime pictures than nighttime pictures, or have more daytime encounters while you're in the tree stand.
And I'm glad we're talking about, again, locating these scrapes around these bedding areas, these thickets, areas where you have a concentration of buck activity in and around that cover, because we've all seen this. I know you have, especially you're in a lot more deciduous forest up here, a lot more hardwoods outside of the hemlocks. Where we're at, it's a lot of pine trees, but there's still areas with oaks. A lot of times the bottoms where they haven't clear cuts where your oaks are at. But again, when those big bottoms is wide open, you'll find tons of scrapes, especially when the oaks start dropping. We've had interviews in the past, earlier this summer, where guys were talking about those situations where you'll find that sign and you hunt it and you don't see anything, because that's either where they were previously at a few weeks ago, right when season opened up and you didn't have opportunity to hunt it, or they're just not getting there before dark. So that's kind of the struggle there, versus finding those scrapes in around that bedding cover could be such a bigger factor. The one thing I would want to ask is for guys getting into, coming into October, getting ready for November, if they have scrapes in mind of where they've seen some of these scrapes, maybe around thick cover, which ones would you lend more value to? Is it one that's just isolated next to one patch of cover, or one that's in between a couple different patches of cover? I don't know if you run into that situation very often.
I do. What I generally find is you usually have a fairly active deer trail kind of on that transition of the thicker cover and the open woods. It's generally also just natural for deer to work through those areas. But I also, especially, this is more of a theory, but I have a lot of belief in it, that mature bucks, especially once we get, into the hunting season, they want to be isolated in their bedding areas. They want to claim a bedding area often. And that's kind of like the neutral zone. That transition is a neutral zone between, to me, his bedding area is more important to him than anything else. The security, owning that area, like he wants to claim the rights to that area. And then you have like this, you start to run into where other deer are moving around the fringes of that bedding area. And then when you find that scrape there, it's a gold mine, because that's where he's checking for other intruders. That's where he's socializing with other deer. Even though, like, we know for a given fact that it's very often for nighttime hours, a mature buck to go into a feeding area with deer of all age classes. Deer, bucks, does, fawns, they'll feed together. But when it comes to bedding, there's that separation. And that's where, like I said, if you can find that scrape, on the fringes of that bedding, and you want other deer to be interacting, because that's going to pique his interest to check that scrape more often. If he's the only one ever going to that scrape, it doesn't mean as much to him. So when you can find that neutral zone where other deer are communicating with him on the fringes of that bedding area, I'm telling you, it's a heck of a spot.
Is a lot of times these scrapes, when you find them close to a bedding area, are they like right on the edge, or do you see them 25 to 50 yards away from the edge? Do you see any differences there of how close that scrape could be to that cover?
I honestly usually just find it on the natural deer trail going through that transition. Now, sometimes what happens is there could be a terrain feature where the trail was following the edge of the cover, but then it runs into some boulders or some logs, and then you'll see the trail shoot out 20 yards around it. But generally, the deer want to be close to that cover, even though, a younger buck might already know that I'm not going in there to bed. But yet again, if I see another human, I'm running in there. I'd rather get my butt kicked by that 5-year-old than run into another hunter. Like, they still feel more safe than with another buck than other humans. But my point is, I think the key is to find that trail. That there's almost always a trail around the edge of that bedding area, around that cover, because it's a transition area. And then I will also say too, sometimes you hit an even bigger jackpot. You'll be following that outer trail, but then you'll notice another trail coming out of the bedding area, and where those two trails meet, you'll find a big scrape, and that can be a heck of a spot to hunt too.
Okay.
Yeah.
Also, do you notice, you're talking about a lot of these bedding areas you're trying to focus on for these mature bucks, a little bit higher up in elevation. Again, we're talking more mountainous country here. Yep. Are you finding those scrapes on the top side or the bottom side of that cover?
Probably more on the bottom side, because I tend to find that they're accessing it from the bottom and then they're leaving from the bottom end, just for the fact that bucks naturally in the mountains will follow the thermals, and they'll transition down into the valleys during the nighttime hours. So I'm more excited when I find that scrape in the bottom, on the bottom edge versus the upper edge, for sure.
Mm. Interesting. Yep. I want to jump back real quick to something that you mentioned about finding that nighttime versus daytime sign. That's a really common question that we get, because a lot of guests mention that. They'll say, oh, that's night sign, or this is probably daylight sign. And a lot of people hear that and they're like, how can you tell just by looking at it? It sounded like what you said was, when you find a high concentration of sign all in one area, that's probably going to be your nighttime sign, and vice versa. If you find isolated sign by itself, that's going to be daytime. Is that correct?
Yes and no. Like, I also factor in, okay, what's the hunting pressure like in this area? How far off the beaten path are we? Because there are areas where I'll find some, even in a feeding area, like if it's very remote, you can catch some daytime activity in there. But generally, when I see a lot of sign, I don't get as excited as what other hunters do. I mean, some of my best spots, there's hardly been a rub or maybe one scrape, like, and it's just amazing the amount of daytime activity you'll get. Usually where you have a lot of sign, it's due to an abundance of deer coming together in one area. Sometimes people will think like, wow, there was 30 rubs on that ridge. That buck must have been rubbing all night. No, there's 5 or 6 bucks coming in there every night feeding on acorns. Like, they're interacting with each other. They're aggressive. They're throwing rubs down because they're trying to fight over territory, or there might be does in the area that they're competing for. So generally that's what happens, but I don't want to tell people to just completely overlook it. I think you have to start questioning and looking into it a little bit deeper. Like, okay, is there some sense to pointing more towards night activity based on how accessible it is, or what are the chances of, is this closer to a bedding area, or things like that. Like, you have to look deeper into it and then just say lots of sign, has to be night activity. There's definitely more into it, making that decision.
But it sounds like you can also look at the environment that scrape is in, and if you find that scrape and you're like, man, here I am on this big oak flat and there's no cover around, like I can see 100 yards off through the woods, the closest good thickets a couple hundred yards away down in a valley or something, or on the next ridge. You could take that information and say, okay, this is a feeding area. It's not, again, a lot of conventional deer hunting media, it would be like, oh, the feeding area would be like, you think a food plot, a cornfield, a feeder, whatever. It's not that. This is in the big woods, so it's not quite as black and white as that. But you can draw that distinction and say, okay, because I'm in a feeding area, this maybe isn't the scrape that I should be really focused on.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, if I was to get excited over, hunting scrapes, especially during the peak scrape period, I'm looking for those best scrapes. I'm not particularly looking for the area with the most scrapes or the most sign, or focusing a ton around feed. I'm always thinking, on a given day, given situation, what is my best chance of catching a buck at a scrape, during daytime hours. And like I said, a lot of times I think people would be surprised if I showed them some of the scrapes that I've had success on over the years. Like, they'd just be like, wow, there's no rubs, there's not many trails, but there's a scrape here. And I'm like, that's the one.